Wow. Hey, much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Thanks for tuning in once again. Today, we're just going to continue reading from this article we were reading regarding Andrew Jackson and his relationship previous to, 1830 and the whole Indian removal. We're talking about his youth, his experience in the American Revolution, his family's experience and where they were growing up and their wars and with certain Indians in certain European countries and their allies with certain Indians and certain Europeans. All right, so we're gonna go on to chapter 2 today. I hope you guys enjoy it. Once again, thanks for tuning in. Check out part 1 if you haven't. It was a great reading. This is just again to get a little background and context of Andrew Jackson and his his whole personal grudge against so-called the Cherokee and certain Indian tribes, because he didn't have beef with all Indians, as we read in part 1. So I hope you guys enjoyed this next chapter. Again, thanks for being here. Let's get started. So we're back at the University of Alabama, and what we found here was this article here, dissertation, Andrew Jackson and the Indians, 1767 to 1815. This is the article right here, Andrew Jackson again and the Indians, by Jonathan Ray, Tony Freyer, Committee Chair David Badel, Larry Clayton, Howard Jones, Gregory Wasilkoff, a dissertation submitted in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in the Department of History in the Graduate School of the University of Alabama. This is from 2014. And we go all the way to page 47. We're going to go to chapter 2. It says here, Jackson, the Indians, and the War for Independence. Although fighting and raids were common throughout 1775 between the Carolinians and the Cherokees, the action intensified in the Cherokee War of 1776. In this war, young Jackson experienced an Indian war in the midst of European attack on Americans. To the Waxhaw community, this was a reminder of the Cherokee War of 1759-1761, in which there was a corresponding European assault on the Americans in the French and Indian War of 1754-1763. A similar problem arose during the Cherokee War of 1776, which coincided with the American War for Independence. In the latter years of the Revolution, when the British attacked the Waxhaw region, Jackson's community faced a triple enemy of British Tories and Indians, most notably the Cherokee Indians. This is what they're facing, right? Jackson and the Waxhaw community. Early in the war, however, colonists from the South Carolina back country, the western North Carolina, whether Whig or Tory, had one common enemy, an enemy that had been terrorizing Carolinians for decades and vice versa, the Cherokees. So when they mean the Carolinians, they mean the settlers and the Indian tribes that were there as well. The Cherokees were enslaving both people. Remember, we will read in chapter 1, and just the whole history. What is a Cherokee? That's also very complex. Although the opposing sides of the American Revolution did have violent clashes in the early years of the Revolution, there were moments when they united against the Cherokees in retaliation for Cherokee raids into Georgia and South Carolina. Jackson learned that the older Carolina generation knew that it was helpful to combat Indians with Indians to mitigate the damage to the Europeans. Carolinians used the Catawbas in 1759, 1761, and again in the Revolution. Jackson learned to recognize Indians who were for and those who were against the Americans. It says here, Americans versus the Cherokees. Many of the combatants in the Cherokee Wars, 1759, 1761, and 1776 were the same. Jackson's military role models fought against the Cherokees during the violent Cherokee War of 1759 to 1761 before the Jacksons arrived in South Carolina. Those men became heroes to the young boys in the back country. When war renewed against the Cherokees, who were aided by the British and Tories, all right? So those were their allies, right? The British and Tories, they were allying with Europeans as well. During the American Revolution, the South Carolina forces resembled that of 15 years before. This continuity of leadership, however, was not one-sided. Some of the young Cherokee leaders who brought fear to South Carolina just before Jackson arrived were the same Cherokee and Chickamauga leaders who terrorized the backcountry and what became Tennessee throughout the 1770s and 1780s. All right, they terrorized the arch enemy of men in Tennessee and along the South Carolina, North Carolina frontier, the famous Chickamauga leader, Dragon Canoe, who led the militant separatist group of Cherokees, as well as young Tassel, John Watts Jr., grew up in the period following the devastating defeat of the Cherokees in 1761. Because of the threat, of an allied Indian attack, American leaders suggested and even insisted upon the recruitment of Indians during wartime. In the South, as Governor James Glenn of South Carolina predicted at mid-century, the Cherokees were the most valuable Indian ally. When Thomas Jefferson, all right, we just did his genealogy, right? And, about his relationship with Sally, right? Hemings. So when Thomas Jefferson was governor of Virginia, he suggested that his state, as well as South Carolina and North Carolina, supply the Cherokees to win their support. Listen, he was on the Cherokee side. The Americans frequently negotiated for Cherokee support. George Washington, throughout his early military career, requested Cherokee support and thought the use of such a body of Indians, joined by some of our woodsmen, would probably strike no small terror into the British and foreign troops, particularly the newcomers. The good resulting from the measure, if these savages can be kept in the field at so great a distance from their native haunts, would more than compensate for the trouble and expense they might cost us. Many other Americans, however, gave up on the prospect of gaining a Cherokee alliance by the time of the Revolution. So it didn't really work out. That was their idea. Richard Henry Lee thought that Congress in 1775 had already taken the most effectual measures to secure the friendship of the Indians all along our extensive frontiers. Jefferson was angry with the Cherokee violence and support of Britain. He said that, "I hope that the Cherokees will now be driven beyond the Mississippi, and that this in the future will be declared to the Indians the invariable consequence of their beginning a war. Our contest with Britain is too serious and too great to permit any possibility of avocation from the Indians. This then is the reason for driving them off, and our southern colonies are happily rid of every other enemy and may exert their whole force in that quarter." All right, you guys hear that, what Jefferson said? He's kind of saying, like, this is kind of the reason we're trying to drive them off or relocate them. They're kind of tired of the violence and how they're also going with the British. These are the same people Jefferson and Andrew Jackson's trying to fight, right? The so-called Americans and the American Revolution, right? But anyways, there's like two sides to every story is what I'm trying to show here, guys. And so that was Jefferson, right? We just learned, we had a video on Jefferson. On the verge of war with Britain in 1776, the signers of the Declaration of Independence acknowledged this cruel method of warfare practiced by the Indians in the list of grievances against King George III. As Jefferson wrote, "The king has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions." So, they're also, and, they came from Europe, they're taking Indian land. So, a lot of Indians are retaliating at that, but at the same time, those same Indians, are are killing other Indian tribes and trying to enslave them and also becoming partners with other European nations. Fighting between the colonists and Cherokees in the early stages of the war was fierce. One Carolina leader describing the American plan of attacking the Punitive expedition following Cherokee raids told his commanders to cut up every Indian cornfield and burn every Indian town. Every Indian taken shall be the slave and property of the taker. The nation shall be extirpated, and the lands become the property of the public. For my part, I shall never give my voice for a peace or for peace with the Cherokee nation upon any other terms than their removal beyond the mountains. All right? This is what they're saying. Okay? The Carolinian echoed the sentiments of Jefferson and the Virginians concerning the defeat and removal of the Cherokees. It wasn't just Andrew Jackson. One of the leaders from Jackson's Carolina, Griffith Rutherford, who led raids on the Cherokees during 1776, said one day after America declared independence that if a Virginia-Carolina alliance could fight the Cherokees, there would be no doubt of a final destruction of the Cherokee nation. Some Carolinians also enslaved Cherokees. Members of the North Carolina delegation to the Continental Congress said that were it not for their Christian duty and conscience, their goal would be to extinguish the very race of them, scarce to leave enough of their existence to be a vestige and proof that a Cherokee nation once was, for that would perhaps be no more than the blood of our slaughtered countrymen might call for. To avoid such a harsh line toward the Cherokees would be a grave mistake because, as one delegate phrased it, mercy to the warriors is cruelty to ourselves. After the Cherokees met with the British at Chota, the violence intensified in a most savage way. In May 1776, just weeks before the Declaration of Independence mentioned the violence of Indian attacks and its connection to the British as a cause of independence, Cherokees killed 17 Europeans as they horribly mutilated them, scalping the entire head and hacking the body into pieces. This was not a skirmish. It was an act of deliberate terror. The addition of the other Indians, supported by the British, to the already gruesome Cherokee method of warfare led to the hatred many Carolinians harbored for the British and their Indian allies. The Cherokee War Plan of 1776 called for taking the offensive. The Overhill warriors, led by Dragon Canoe, attacked present-day eastern Tennessee, including the Carter's Valley, Clinch, Nolichucky, Watauga, and Holston settlements. Dragon Canoe personally led the assault on Carter's Valley and Holston, while Great Warrior raided Watauga and Nolichucky. Jackson, though experienced the Cherokee War of 1776 in South Carolina, which was the second part of the Cherokee Plan, the Cherokees sent 600 warriors, led by the Middle and Valley towns, into Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. In June 1776, while the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia to discuss declaring independence from Britain, Cherokees, supplied by the British, raided the southern frontier. South Carolinians had predicted a month before independence that whenever any one of the southern colonies shall be attacked on the seacoast, they will attack the same province on the frontiers. And that prediction came true. The Lower Town Cherokees, the most peaceful of the four groups and closest to the Waxhaws, brought the Cherokee War of 1776 into South Carolina as they tore through the backcountry, destroying property, taking prisoners, and killing settlers. The same group then attacked western North Carolina less than a week after the colonists declared independence, killing 37 colonists. Meanwhile, the Overhill warriors raided villages, destroyed buildings, sending some settlers back east for safety. While the Cherokees were assaulting the frontier, other groups were aiding them. The British gave them provisions, and Western Indians were increasingly sending supplies or warriors. You hear that? Western Indians. Past the plains and the west coast, southwest, huh? Listen to that. All this occurred just as the Americans declared the independence and were awaiting the British invasion. These Western Indians are alien with British and Cherokees. South Carolina ordered British agent Alexander Cameron to leave Cherokee land because he was aiding and inciting the enemy, and then the Americans tried to assassinate him. James Colbert, a Loyalist Chickasaw agent, brought 100 horseloads of supplies and ammunition to the Cherokees to support the raids. The British then ordered agent John Stewart to actively recruit Creeks to assist in the Cherokee raids. Dragon Canoe met with Henry Stewart, then on his way from Mobile with ammunition and Creek allies after courting more Indians to join the Tories and the British. The Tories were involved as well in July 1776, and most notoriously so, as the Whigs captured four Tories, painted like Indians. Cameron then fled to Creek country as the war between the Americans and the Cherokees intensified, and Dragon Canoe moved the headquarters of the Chickamauga to present-day Chattanooga. In response to the Cherokee raids and the British strengthening ties with the hostile Indians, the southern colonies launched punitive expeditions throughout the summer and fall of 1776 and 1777. General Griffith Rutherford of North Carolina in July 1776 ordered a combined force of 2,500 North Carolinians and South Carolinians to march against the Cherokees. In all, over 6,000 men from South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia retaliated against the Cherokees for their actions of the spring of 1776 at the command of General Charles Lee, the Southern commander of the Continental Army, and other generals such as Rutherford, Thomas Sumter, William Thompson, and Andrew Williamson. South Carolina, including men from the Waxhaws, had already been punishing the Cherokees, but by mid-1776, as the South Carolina troops continued to invade the lower towns, North Carolinians joined the South Carolina forces in assaulting the middle and valley towns, while the Virginians raided the powerful overhill towns. By August 1776, Williamson led 1,100 men into Cherokee territory and burned Catawba. The South Carolina forces under Williamson burned every town and destroyed all the corn from the Cherokee line to the middle settlement that same month. The forces faced stiff resistance through the lower towns and into the valley towns, but marched on under Williamson, went to Cameron's abandoned plantation, and stole his slaves and livestock. The Cherokees retreated because of a lack of ammunition. Rutherford destroyed the greater part of the valley towns and captured seven Europeans among the Indians. Then Williamson and Rutherford's combined forces destroyed the corn and everything that might be of service to the Indians. The damage was so great that the Americans flattered themselves that the southern states will suffer no further damage this season from the savages, as it will employ their whole time to provide sustenance and shelter for their squaws and children. The lower towns had warned the middle and valley towns of how powerful the American forces were. Cameron urged the Cherokees to continue the resistance as he recruited Creeks to join his Indian allies. Rutherford led his combined forces into the middle towns to subdue those savage wretches and destroy the vacated towns with little resistance. Although there were some incidents of resistance on August 23, 1776, the Council of Safety reported that the lower valley of middle settlements have abandoned their towns. In addition to hunting down the Cherokees, Rutherford also wanted to expel the Creek Indians. The many European men and the British agents supporting the Cherokees. He found no Indians in many of the middle towns and marched on into the valley towns. The Cherokees fled many of the towns, and the European soldiers were angry because they wanted a chance for satisfaction. One soldier in Williamson's group said that it grieves us that we should not have an engagement to get satisfaction of them, heathens, for the great slavery and hardships they put us to. You guys hear that? That's why they're going after the Cherokees, because of the great slavery and hardships they put us to before that in previous decades and times, years. For 2 weeks in September 1776, Williamson and Rutherford led their forces on a Scorched-earth campaign that destroyed 30 Cherokee Middle and Valley towns as the Carolinians returned home with Cherokee captives, slaves, livestock, and received 75 pounds for every scalp. The Virginians attacked the overhill towns, but the Carolinians refused incursions into these hostile settlements and returned home because of the fierce resistance beyond the mountains and in the dangerous mountain passes. Following the punitive expeditions, some of the Cherokees were ready for peace. By 1776, the lower, middle, and valley towns asked for a truce as some of them fled to the overhill towns. The militant overhill towns were not a safe refuge and struggled to continue resistance as they were running out of ammunition. The Virginians destroyed the overhill towns of Great Island, Tellico, Chilhowee, and Setico, while sparing the capital of Chota, but left thousands of Cherokees homeless, many of whom escaped into Creek territory or western Florida, right? Florida, so-called runaways. The Cherokees left their livestock and belongings as they fled their villages. In the chaos, their towns, well, all burned, their corn cut down, and themselves driven into the woods to perish, and a great many of them killed. One soldier observed that the Cherokees were reduced to a state of the most deplorable and wretched, being often obliged to subsist on insects and reptiles of every kind. The punitive expeditions left the Cherokees temporarily impotent. Many Cherokee leaders, especially the elder leaders, requested a peaceful settlement. The Raven, Atakulakula, and Okonosotosa led the talks. Dragon Canoe and the militant Chickamauga faction, however, refused to settle for peace. George Washington also wanted a settlement with the Southern Indians, but warned of another invasion if the Cherokees continued to fight. By mid 1777, the Cherokees agreed to two treaties that ended the conflict of the Cherokee War of 1776, the Treaty of DeWitt Corner in May, and the Treaty of Long Island of Holston in July. In the Treaty of DeWitt's Corner, the Cherokees ceded to South Carolina the lands along the Savannah and Saluda rivers and east of the Unicoi Mountains, promised to release all captives and property, and declared the intention to deliver any Loyalists who had participated in the war. In total, the Cherokees lost 5,264 acres in these treaties. This settlement forced Lower Town Cherokees to move into Georgia or settle with the still militant Chickamaugas near Chattanooga. Even as negotiations were going on, Dragon Canoe scalped Europeans and stole horses in the vicinity of the treaty grounds. In the treaty at Long Island of Holston, the American representatives from North Carolina and Virginia wanted all Cherokee land north of the Little Tennessee River. The Cherokees angrily refused but ceded all land north of the Nolichucky River, except the Long Island of the Holston River. The Virginia delegation insisted on peace, restitution for damages, and a rejection of the British by the Cherokees. But the Cherokees reminded the Virginians, "Do you remember that the difference is about our land?" The colonists did try to settle the land dispute through treaties and various laws telling the Europeans to stay off Cherokee land and limit the use of the militia and confrontations with the Cherokees. But much of it was hard to enforce, particularly because the Americans were more concerned with the American War for Independence by 1777. James Robertson, founder of Nashville, became Indian Commissioner to the Overhill Cherokees following the treaty. Cherokee leader Old Tassels summed up the feelings of the Cherokees at the Treaty of Long Island of Holston. "It is surprising that when we enter into treaties with our fathers, the European people, their whole cry is more land. We do not quarrel with you for the killing of an occasional buffalo or deer on our lands. But your people go further, much further. They hunt to gain a livelihood. They kill all our game. But it is very criminal, and our young men, if they chance to kill a cow or hog for their subsistence when they happen to be in your lands, the Great Spirit has placed us in different situations. He has given you many advantages. He has stocked your lands with cows, ours with buffaloes, yours with hogs, ours with bears, yours with sheep, ours with deer. He has given you the advantage that your animals are tame, while ours are wild and demand not only a larger space for range, but are to hunt and kill them. They are nevertheless as much our property as other animals are yours, and ought not to be taken from us without our consent or for something of equal value. To the Cherokees, the difference was land, but to the Europeans they scalped and murdered, the issue was survival, particularly as the Cherokees gained numerous Indian allies and had the support of the official enemy of the colonists, Britain. Also, although Old Tassel and the elder generation of Cherokees talked about peace, the militant faction, the Chickamaugas led by Dragon Canoe, were at war with the Americans and continued to be so throughout Jackson's early life. The Americans could not enforce their treaties on all Europeans, and the Cherokees lacked the authority to impose the agreements on all Indians, despite any good intentions the leaders of either side may have had. The people Jackson knew as a child saw the conflict firsthand rather than in the peaceful post war discussions. The men along the borders of North Carolina and South Carolina knew the danger of the Cherokees and had helped to temporarily bring an end to the hostilities in the early phase of the war. The Cherokees' threat revived. However, the British support in 1780, after the British took over the Waxhaws in 1780 1781, burned the meeting house and took Jackson, his brother, and 7 other John Waxhaw boys prisoner. The Waxhaws were vacant. The Catawbas had also fled, and the region was not a major threat to the British or the Indians of the West. Still, other Americans knew the threat to the West, and if the people of the Waxhaws wanted to return to a normal life, the threat must be removed. Even after the punitive expedition against the Cherokees, frontier Americans did not trust the Indians and believed the Creeks, Cherokees, Tories, and company were planning a coordinated attack in 1781. There was good reason to be suspicious. North Carolina Governor Alexander Martin knew that the Chickamaugas asked no favors, being still determined to do all the injury they can. Some Americans, however, including Southern Commander Nathaniel Greene, were willing to negotiate with the Cherokees. Greene told John Sevier, I remember that last name, and Martin to negotiate with the Cherokees and other friendly tribes for prisoners, boundaries, and peace. Greene did this, however, without congregational approval because of the importance of stopping the ravages of two such powerful nations of savages encouraged at a great experience by the enemy, and in the critical situation things were in the southern states, the measure will appear prudent and necessary, and though accomplished with some expense, meet the approbation of Congress. The Americans did meet with Cherokees in the late spring of 1781, while young John Jackson was in a Camden jail as a captive of the British. All right? He was a captive before. You guys hear that? The Cherokees admitted to the Americans that they had behaved as rogues by joining the British and were now willing to accept peace. In early September 1781, the Cherokees went to Virginia to discuss peace with the Americans, but informed the British that they only met with the Americans to make the rebels believe the nation meant peace, but it was only to save the corn upon the ground and prevent our towns being burnt. When our corn is made, we will attack them with as much spirit as ever. By December 1781, however, after promising peace with the Americans, the Cherokees were again raiding the South Carolina frontier. Pickens and Elijah Clark invaded Cherokee territory and found many towns deserted. The Americans demanded the release of prisoners, and the Cherokees agreed to cede territory from Savannah to South Carolina. The leading scholar of the Chickamaugas, however, says that the expedition was not a total victory for the Americans as Pickens, Clark, General Charles, McDowell, Sevier, and Evan Shelby were not coordinated in their attacks. Still, the Americans did inflict punishment on the Cherokees. This action, however, led more peaceful Cherokees into the camp of the ever increasingly hostile Chickamaugas. All right, and we continue in the article, and this part it says here the Waxhaws, the Catawbas, and the War for Independence. Men from Jackson's home along the Catawba frontier fought a two-front war against the Cherokees to the west and the Tories and their invading British allies at home. Historian Mary Eleanor Lazenby compiled first-hand experiences of these men from the North Carolina and South Carolina border on the Catawba River and Catawba frontier, 1775-1781. Memories of Pensioners. The compilation is full of men raiding the hostile Cherokees early in the War for Independence, only to return home to fight Tories and British regulars. To these men, as well as to young Jackson, the revolution was not just an attempt to rid themselves of British control, but also a war to secure their western border from Indian attacks. The British and the Indians were colluding to destroy the Americans along the Catawba frontier. Jackson was familiar with many of these men because he referenced the leader of one of the Cherokee expeditions, Rutherford, in his detailed account of his own experiences in the Revolution. Jackson, when explaining his capture by the British, noted that Rutherford had been made prisoner as Jackson escaped Rawdon and Tarleton by retreating to North Carolina. In Lazenby's compilation, several of the men remembered following Rutherford into Cherokee territory. Abraham Forney, James Graham, James Gillespie, John Morrison, Jeremiah Scruggs, David Dobbins, and Joseph Sharp all joined General Rutherford in his Cherokee raid of 1776. Many of Jackson's neighbors from along the Catawba River and the North Carolina-South Carolina border, including the Waxhaws, participated in the Cherokee War of 1776, which was a scorched-earth campaign. In 1775, William Alexander stated that his mission was to protect the valley of the Catawba from incursions of the Cherokees. In 1777, 14-year-old William Falls went with his father, who was a captain to Davidson's Ford on the Catawba River, to guard the frontier against Cherokee invasions. William Knox, who died after accidentally being shot by one of his own men while on the Cherokee expedition, was, according to the American General Gazette in 1776, defending the just right of his injured country and pursuing the Cherokees who had committed atrocities against the colonists. Robert Knox went to Tryon County, now Rutherford County, North Carolina, to protect the frontier and received fire from hostile Indians in a grain field. Another veteran of the American War for Independence, William Lenore, stated that in the summer of 1776, Americans from along the Catawba River were trapped between two enemies. The British and Tories threatened the inhabitants from the east, and the Cherokees posed danger from the west. These Americans living just north of Jackson on the Catawba River had been compelled to flee their homes because of the depredations committed upon them and from the great danger of their situation. But when they sought security in the interior settlements, they faced danger from the Cherokees. As far away as Surry County, the people had been much alarmed and annoyed by the depredations of the Indians. To the people of the Catawba frontier, Britain and the Cherokees were a common enemy that worked together to terrorize the Americans. The Americans were quite successful in their expedition against the Cherokees in 1776, but another enemy, with whom these forces would fight throughout the rest of the war, was ready for battle back in the Carolinas, the British and their Tory allies. The soldiers of the Catawba frontier frequently recalled the immediate transition from fighting Indians along and beyond the mountains to fighting Tories and British in their hometowns. Archibald Houston, who was with General Rutherford along the Catawba River in North Carolina, stated that he combined forces with the troops from South Carolina while fighting the Cherokees across the mountains. After destroying the Indian crops and killing a few Indians, the troops marched directly home for the purpose of keeping down the Tories who were rising in that section. Houston and his men were guarding and defending the neighborhood from the notorious raider Tory Sam Brown. 1776 was the year for the troops from western North and South Carolina to fight the Cherokees along the frontier, and 1777 was the year to return home and fight the Tories. In addition to Houston, several other soldiers mentioned the need to quickly return home to fight the European enemy after raiding Cherokee towns. Lenore described how the Cherokees ambushed troops from South Carolina, killing 15 Europeans and then burying them in a swamp. The soldiers fighting alongside Lenore were suffering, and many died from exposure, privation, and fatigue. Still following the summer raid across the mountain on Cherokee towns, they had to rush back east and fight Tories. James Martin, colonel of the Guilford County, North Carolina militia, mentioned the lack of downtime between the raid on Cherokees to fighting Tories in 1777. The war against the three enemies continued throughout the remainder of the Revolution. As Jackson spent the late 1770s and early 1780s moving from South Carolina across the border to North Carolina, depending on where British troops were invading. James McFadden, who was a veteran of the 1776 Cherokee expedition, stated that he spent the whole year of 1779 harried by Indians and Tories. In 1781, he spent 3 months fighting in Cherokee territory. Thomas Wright, who volunteered in June 1776 for war with the Cherokee Indians, participated in several skirmishes against the Cherokees and drove the Indians from their towns. He then fought a combination of British and Tory forces in 1780. Wright signed up to protect his homeland from Cherokee raids and ended fighting off British advances. The Catawba Indians also supported the European neighbors in the Cherokee War of the 1776. So just like the Cherokees were allying with certain Europeans or so-called whites, the Catawbas are allying with so-called whites. But remember, a lot of these are melanated Europeans, black Europeans. A lot of them, they have some connections anciently. Their family, they're mixed together. They're not just allying, just like the Cherokees are mixing with some of the ones they're allying with. This is the stuff they kind of leave out. All right, but yeah, this happened, right? Certain Europeans allied with certain American Indian tribes and they fight each other. Their primary role for South Carolina throughout 1776 was to capture runaway slaves. The Catawbas went on expeditions to capture fugitive slaves under Captain Samuel Boykin. They were also successful as scouts for the American forces in 1776. They received colony pay for defending Charleston against a possible British attack in 1776. Those Catawbas, serving under Andrew Williamson, invaded Cherokee territory and burned Cameron's plantation. As 20 Catawba scouts assisted the South Carolinians as they fought Cherokees and burned a town. Several Catawbas lost their lives in 1776 fighting under the command of Williamson against Cherokees near Franklin, North Carolina. For Jackson and the Carolinians of his generation, there was not a hatred of all Indians, okay? Again, I get this clear, everybody. For Jackson and the Carolinians of his generation, there was not a hatred of all Indians. The Catawba's willing support of the Americans was evidence of more complex European-Indian relationship. The Catawbas proved to be loyal allies of the Americans following One Creek raid in 1779, and the South Carolinians relied on their one true Indian ally, the Catawbas, for additional support. In spring 1779, William Moultrie wrote Governor Rutledge and specifically requested some Catawba warriors who would be of infinite service against the Creeks, and he shall be very glad to have them. While Jackson and the Americans and the Waxhaws were facing a triple threat of British, Tories, and Indians, led by the Cherokees to the west, the Americans, loyal Indians, the Catawbas, though small in number, played a vital role in 1780. One leading historian of the Catawbas insists that the Americans may not have had victory at Kings Mountain had the Catawbas not been loyal. You guys hear that? How important it was to the so-called Americans, you know, beating these battles they had with the so-called British, but they're also fighting Tories, Loyalists, British, Cherokees, a lot of Cornwallis, either dishonest or unaware of what British agents were doing among the Cherokees, were offering amnesty to the rebels, said that the only Indians employed since the invasion of Carolina are those of the Catawba by the rebels. General Thomas Sumter actively recruited Catawbas to join his army. He specifically used them to find Loyalist hideouts in the South Carolina backcountry. Some Catawbas served under Sumter throughout his southern campaign. Others, led by Catawba General New River, joined Colonel William Richardson Davie and Jackson's cousin, Major Robert Crawford. It was nothing new for Jackson's family to interact with the Catawbas, as his older brother, Hugh, had fought Cherokees in the Waxhaws and hunted with the docile Catawba. All right, listen, his brother was mad cool with the Catawbas, while Andrew was a young boy. The Catawbas during the Revolution normally fought under European leadership, but had a separate company of 41 men under Captain Thomas Drennan from 1780 to 1782. When British Lord Rawdon arrived in the Waxhaws in the summer of 1780, the Tories were afraid of the Catawbas and asked the British for protection. The British again tried, but failed to enlist Catawba support. When the Jacksons and other Waxhaws residents evacuated the district north of the South Carolina border following the British invasion, the Catawbas fled as well to North Carolina and Virginia. Many historians have largely ignored the Catawbas' contributions to the people of the Carolinas, particularly the Catawbas' neighbors in the Waxhaws. Their mere support meant one less enemy to combat as the region was attacked from all sides. This is why the Catawbas were helping or joining, because they were also being attacked from all sides. One leading historian of the Catawbas calls their role in the war rather negligible. Another says it is unlikely that the Catawba nation ever determined a battle in the American War for Independence. The leading historian of the British campaign in the Carolinas during the early 1780s does not even mention the Catawbas. Another leading Revolutionary War scholar only discusses their role as slave catchers. So what he's pointing out is that they kind of neglected the history, how important the role was, really. The Catawbas did serve, as has been shown earlier, throughout the war, and they continued to contribute to the overall American war effort, but in a significant way to the people along the Carolina border. In 1781, at the Battle of Haw River, on February 25, the Catawba warriors shared in the American victory and inflicted several casualties on the British. On March 15th, at the Pyrrhic British victory at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Catawba served as scouts for General Nathaniel Greene. On September 8, in the last major battle in the Carolinas at the Battle of Eutaw Springs in Orangeburg County, South Carolina, Catawbas fought alongside Patriot forces. All right, Catawbas fought alongside Patriot forces. The Catawbas offered other types of support in addition to military service in the latter years of the war. They supplied the American soldiers with food, specifically beef and corn. After the British took Charleston in May 1780, the Catawba Reservation became a center of resistance. The Catawbas allowed Sumter to use the reservation as a base of operation as he gathered 500 soldiers there in the summer of 1780, and 200 Catawba soldiers joined Sumter's men. They supplied food for the Americans and allowed Sumter to use their reservation as headquarters. but they also lost alongside the Americans. During 1780 and 1781, the British destroyed Catawba villages and the Waxhaws. Again, what did the British do? Destroyed Catawba villages and the Waxhaws. When the Catawbas returned home from helping the Americans in battle in late 1781, they found that all was gone: cattle, hogs, fowls, etc., all gone, as they spent years sacrificing with the Americans. So we continue with the article. It says here the British and the Indians. The British brought devastation onto Jackson's Waxhaw community and destroyed his family, listen, and his society, while possibly destroying his future. In addition to the immediate harm the British brought to Jackson's world, they also brought continual paranoia and fear because of the possibility of British-supported Indian attacks on Jackson and his family before and throughout the revolution. All right, so the British and the Cherokees, this is what they're doing to his family. This is, just giving you a little background to why he hated the Cherokees so much. Both Britain and America were negotiating with the four major tribes of the American South: Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, and Choctaw. Both countries also competed for the loyalty of the Indian tribe in the Waxhaw settlement, the Catawba. From the beginning of the war, many Western Indians supported Britain, although the Cherokees were the most threatening tribe to Jackson. Only one of the four major tribes, the Chickasaws, was completely loyal to the British throughout the war. When the Chickasaws pledged loyalty to Britain in 1777, they threatened to punish the Choctaws if the tribe did not join. The Choctaws then joined the British and their Indian allies. They plainly stated their reasons for loyalty, as one Choctaw chief said: "Two people love us, and whoever gives us the most will be the most regarded." The Americans learned that gifts purchased Indian loyalty. The Chickasaws and Choctaws were not a direct threat to Jackson during the Revolution, but they did help the British-Cherokee War effort by defending the Mississippi River, while Creeks and Cherokees invaded the eastern colonies. The Chickasaws captured settlers and gave them to John Stuart to ransom. By 1780, in need of supplies, the Choctaws joined Cherokees and Creeks in joint raids under the British flag, again under the British flag, in return for gunpowder. Threats from the Cherokees, who occupied parts of western South Carolina, North Carolina, and what would later become Tennessee across the Appalachian Mountains, were most significant because of the size, sophistication, and strength of the tribe. The Catawbas, if mobilized for or against the Americans, would make a difference, not because of their size or strength, as they were relatively weak at the time of the American Revolution, but because of their location in Jackson's immediate vicinity. The Creeks were dangerous because of their brutality and strength and relative closeness. The Chickasaws and Choctaws were not an immediate concern of the Waxhaw residents because of their distance, but could become a major player if the British convinced these western tribes to come east. Also, there remained the looming threat of a raid from the north by the Iroquois, who were the habitual enemies of the Catawbas. All right, so now they got to deal with the Iroquois too, the Catawbas. So this is a lot of context that is missing from even this article. Way before all these wars, the Iroquois, the Cherokees, all these so-called tribes were invading, messing with the Catawbas, trying to take their land, their people, for many years, guys, for many, many years before all this. So this is like they're saying another threat from the north, the Iroquois. And again, how they're telling you they're habitual enemies because there's many years of them warring against the Catawbas. We know how the Iroquois invades other tribes. We know how they roll, their history. Check out the videos I've done on that. In 1778, the British Cherokee Alliance, again British Cherokee Alliance, continued, though the year was not filled with the intensity of Cherokee and American raids of 1776. By 1778, however, There was a major split in the Cherokee Nation as the lower valley and middle towns were less active, and the overhill towns were divided between the older generation of the Cherokees and the younger generation of the Chickamaugas. The Chickamaugas and some Cherokees were willing to help the British defeat the Americans in 1778 because they needed British supplies following crop failures. European settlers were coming over the mountains at a rate of 100 per month, and the colonists had developed a large and growing settlement near present-day Knoxville and eastern Tennessee. Following a meeting with 400 Cherokees in Pensacola in January 1778, John Stuart was sure that the bulk of Indians would join His Majesty's forces. He was correct, as thousands of Western Indians continued to support the British. Western Indians. The number of British Indian allies was growing, as in October 1778, Henry Hamilton, who was notorious for helping the British to gain Indian allies to attack the frontier, met with a group of Cherokees, Chippewas, Wyandots, Shawnees, Ottawas, and Miami at the Miami village at Petit Gris on the St. Joseph River. Hamilton promised them supplies in return for their loyalty, which would include the Cherokees attacking the Carolina backcountry. The Indians passed war bells and agreed to Hamilton's offer. You hear that? To go war against other Indians too, not just settlers. The overhill Cherokees, Chickamaugas, and Cherokees in northern Georgia joined Loyalists, refugees, and attacked the frontier, intercepted communications, and disrupted supply lines throughout 1778. Other Chickamaugas, instigated by British emissaries, fought to keep colonists away from the Tennessee River, which earned them support from peaceful Cherokees and Upper Creeks to raid the frontier. The Chickamaugas also welcomed Loyalist refugees into their towns. British agents Cameron, John MacDonald, and Walter Scott met with the Chickamaugas, supplied them, and coordinated attacks upon the Americans. The Chickamaugas often received supplies by horse from Pensacola. The Americans again raised troops to combat the Indians to the west. The troops the southern colonies used against the Indians could have been used to fortify the colonies against the pending British invasion. North Carolina raised a force of 400 militia to protect the frontier against the Indian incursions. Governor Patrick Henry of Virginia ordered a joint raid by Virginia and North Carolina to stop the Chickamaugas. In 1779, the British side of the war directly affected the Jacksons. Until 1779, most of the Jacksons and their relatives, the Crawfords, experience with the Revolution was the fear of British invasion and the real fear of the Cherokee War throughout the Carolina border region and to the west. In 1779, Davy, Jackson's uncle, James Crawford, Jackson's brother, Hugh Jackson, and other men from the Waxhaws went to Charlestown to defend the capital city against the British attack. While Jackson's older brother and older role models went to Charlestown to fight off the British invasion to the west, the British continued to recruit hostile Indians and raid the backcountry. The Chickamaugas, always loyal to the British, spent the early months of 1779 stocking supplies they received for the British in preparation of a spring offensive against the Carolinas and Georgia. That includes a lot of Indian tribes that are in those places. Dragon Canoe wholeheartedly supported the British against Americans because Cameron, in addition to supplying the nation and helping curb colonists, settlement of Cherokee land, planned to help Dragon Canoe bring all the Cherokees into one united Chickamauga community. The Chickamaugas proved their loyalty by joining Britain in an attack on Savannah in April of 1779. By the end of that year, the Chickamaugas had 11 villages south of the overhill towns and received their supplies from the British in Pensacola and the creeks to the south. Stuart recruited additional Choctaws and Creeks by telling them that the Americans were too weak for another invasion, particularly now that the British Army was among the southern colonies. and that the British could offer support against a raid should one occur. Some Upper Creeks who had been on the American side or neutral threw their support behind Britain after receiving supplies from the British in 1779. The British took advantage of their Indian allies and used them to raid the back country as British forces moved inland from the east. At least 800 Cherokees, Chickamaugas, and Upper Creeks raided South Carolina in 1779. All but 75 of the Chickamaugas warriors were busy in 1779 either raiding South Carolina or Georgia or protecting the Tennessee River. Dragon Canoe and Cameron led a force of 305 Indians, plus Loyalists, in an invasion of Georgia and South Carolina in August of 1779. By 1779, the Creeks were as forceful as the Cherokees had been earlier in support of Britain. In April, at least 30 Creeks joined Loyalists who were painted and dressed like Indians. Listen, Loyalists who were painted and dressed like Indians and burning the house of a Whig in the back country of South Carolina. The British, after recruiting 200 Lower Creeks to raid South Carolina, acknowledged that the supplies bought the loyalty of the Creeks, for without presents, the Indians are not to be depended on. A total of 200 Creeks raided South Carolina, confiscating property, including slaves, throughout the spring and summer of 1779, as Jackson's brother and uncle were away from home fighting the British. All right, so just want to again remind everybody, as I'm reading, there is a lot of footnotes here. There is sources you can follow up on to see, if all this is correct in history. And I did check most of the sources when I first got the article, and yeah, it was matching what they were kind of saying. Of course, there's parts that they say may have, but those parts they don't have sources for. So those are just ideas. But for most of the historic part, they do have sources, for this article, right? As the British raided the Waxhaws from the east throughout 1780 and 1781, destroying the lives and property of many of the residents, they used the Indians to attack the Europeans in the west. In April of 1780, 9 families from the Carolina backcountry were traveling to Natchez when brutally attacked by a combined force of Cherokees and their Shawnee allies, killing 40 Europeans. In June 1780, Governor Jefferson of Virginia, fearing a combined British-Indian assault, appointed William Campbell to lead Virginia troops against hostile Cherokees and Chickamaugas to stop the British interference in the west and bring peace to the southern frontier. After Americans defeated British and Tories at Kings Mountain on October 7, 1780, British General Cornwallis ordered Cherokees to attack frontier settlements. The Cherokees then joined the British in raiding the frontier. John Sevier fought the Cherokees in mid-December 1780 and found in their baggage British documents and proclamations from Hamilton. All right, you guys hear that? Campbell, recognizing the need for action against the Cherokees, said that if the enemy are not repelled before they get leave to penetrate into the country this winter, we must the ensuing summer, 1781, be subjected to the depredations of a savage enemy. Campbell joined Sevier in late December 1780, and the two men led forces that burned Toccoa, Chilhowee, and smaller villages. The Cherokees then asked for peace, but it was too late and Campbell was resolute. He refused the Cherokees' request for peace, then burned Chota, Setico, and Tuskegee. When he captured the town of Hiawassee, he learned that the British agent John Macdonald was conspiring with Indians and Tories at the Chickamauga town of Chester, 12 miles away. The punitive raids of 1780 were devastating to the Cherokees, but not as bad as they had been in 1776. Campbell's group destroyed more than 1,000 Cherokee houses, 50,000 bushels of corn, and other supplies. This destruction pushed many Cherokees into the Chickamauga British camp, but forced some Cherokees to ask for peace. In 1781, although the Cherokees were discussing peace with the Americans, the Raven told the British at Savannah that the Americans attacked in late 1780 In such numbers last fall, there was no withstanding them. They dyed their hands in the blood of many of our women and children, burnt 17 towns, destroyed all our provisions, by which we and our families were almost destroyed by famine this spring. Some Americans feared that the raids on the Cherokees in late 1780 would make the Indians irreconcilable enemies of the Americans and hurt Whig recruiting efforts, but others understood the Cherokee British connection and the need to stop the dangerous alliance to secure the frontier and achieve independence. As the British devastated Jackson's homeland, again, as the British with the Cherokee Indians devastated Jackson's homeland in the Waxhaws, they encouraged the Cherokees to terrorize the frontier as Jackson's family tried to escape. You guys understand the background, right? After the Battle of Yorktown in October 1781, Americans had the momentum and moved toward victory after the British surrender. But for Jackson, the Catawbas, and the people of the Carolinas, the war was still going on to the west. The British still claimed to have large numbers of Indian supporters to the west, including 3,000 Cherokees, 7,319 Creeks, 7,022 Choctaws, and 750 Chickasaws. South Carolinians seeking revenge on the Cherokees and unwilling to trust them after the failed negotiations of 1781 wanted another raid on the Cherokees. General Andrew Pickens led the South Carolina troops along with some troops from Georgia. North Carolina sent 1,000 men under the condition that the Americans not harm friendly Cherokee towns and that the commanders observe strict discipline among the men, suffering no marauding or plundering by individuals. And we continue in the article, all right? It says here, the British and the Waxhaws. Members of the Waxhaw community saw action early in the Revolution, although the fighting did not affect the district directly until 1780. At the beginning of the war in 1775, some Waxhaw volunteers went on a raid to subdue Cherokees and Loyalists nearby in western South Carolina. From the start, Cherokees were synonymous with the British in the American War for Independence, imposing the main threat early in the war to the backcountry. In 1779, however, Jackson's older brother, Hugh, and uncle and mentor James Crawford went with William Richardson Davie to defend Charlestown against the British in 1779. At age 12, Jackson suffered his first loss to the British. Listen to this, guys. When his brother, Hugh, died, all right? He lost his brother to the British and the Cherokees. Again, he had a lot of personal hate because of this. Hugh died. Hugh Jackson fought at the Battle of Stono in 1779 and collapsed from exhaustion. He barely made it home following the battle, then died and was buried in the churchyard at the Waxhaw Meeting House. Fighting alongside Hugh at Stono were several Catawba Indians. They were fighting with Jackson's brother, look, the Catawba Indians from the Waxhaw community. The British Army invaded the Waxhaws in late 1780. Jackson said that during this invasion, he saw British General Banastre Tarleton pass through. Tarleton, in addition to brutally attacking Jackson's South Carolina neighbors, passed through Jackson's neighborhood on the way to recruit Catawbas for the British cause. Britain had already enlisted the support of the 4 major southern Indian tribes, instilling fear into the backcountry of South Carolina, and now Tarleton recruited the lone friendly tribe in South Carolina. Okay, now just remembering real quick, guys, just going off topic a little bit, Tarleton, I believe we did a video showing he was a so-called black man. He was described as very swarthy, dark complexioned in many sources. Just a side note there, okay? Continuing, it says, John Jackson and the Carolinians particularly hated Tarleton. All right, the Carolinians, John Jackson, and the Catawbas, what? Hated Tarleton. Jackson later in life recalled that he made a mistake when he, after viewing Tarleton, let him go when he was so close that Jackson could have shot him. Although there was always a hatred of the British, most residents of the Waxhaws wanted to avoid the conflict. They did avoid direct conflict against the British until the invasion of 1780, when over half of the Waxhaw men enlisted to defend their homes. In May 1780, the British captured Charlestown and moved toward North Carolina to put down the Whigs, including Jackson's uncle, James Crawford. On May 29, 1780, British troops arrived in the Waxhaws. The Americans had only 350 Virginia regulars to defend them under the command of Colonel Abraham Buford. General Cornwallis sent Tarleton with 270 to prevent Buford and his men from reinforcing Salisbury, North Carolina. In one of the more brutal attacks of the war, Tarleton killed Buford's forces while they were trying to surrender near Camden, South Carolina at Buford's massacre. You guys hear that? 113 Americans were killed that day. 60 died later from wounds, and 54 were taken prisoner, right? So where was this? In the Waxhaws communities. That's where Jackson and his family grew up. A lot of the Catawba Indians grew up, so this is who they massacred. Jackson, an early teenager at the time, saw the effects of this massacre. Following Buford's defeat and the subsequent pillaging by the British troops, the Waxhaw residents moved the wounded to the meeting house, which became a hospital. Elizabeth Jackson, Andrew's mother, Robert, his brother, and young Andrew treated the wounded. Several men were missing one or both arms as a result of the slashing of Tarleton's troops. Each man attacked had at least 3 gashes, and some had as many as 13 gashes on them. After the tragedy, many Waxhaw men sought revenge. Tarleton tried to enlist Catawba's support, but the tribe joined the Americans in waging guerrilla warfare under British invaders. This loyalty surely had impact on the young Jackson. Tarleton returned to the Waxhaws and demanded that every man swear an oath of loyalty to King George III. Jackson and his cousins, the Crawfords, escaped to Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. The British left the Waxhaws thinking there was nothing remaining except poor Irish. The western South Carolina European communities were, in effect, one big Irish Presbyterian settlement, all right? Protestant, Irish Protestants. A lot of these were so-called Black Irish, the ones I showed you in my Black Irish videos, guys, like put it all together. These a lot of people mixing with the Catawbas. Same, Irish also going on, a lot of them, into the lands of the 5 civilized tribes and mixing with them as well. But a lot of them did end up coming in and assimilating, coming together with a lot of the tribes of the Carolinas. During the summer of 1780, Davie led South Carolina Continental Army troops under Jackson's cousin Robert Crawford, volunteers and militia from Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, where many residents of the Waxhaws had sought refuge during the British invasion, and a band of Catawbas on the General New River. They fought to prevent the enemy from foraging on the borders of North Carolina and check the depredations of the Loyalists who infested that part of the country. Throughout the summer of 1780, the Americans found whatever food they could as British soldiers foraged the crops of the Waxhaws, depleting Jackson's community of provisions and turning his community into a ghost town, with residents scattered into North Carolina. Jackson saw British forces firsthand at the Battle of Hanging Rock on August 6, 1780, as American forces led by veteran General Thomas Sumter defeated the larger Loyalist forces. Young Jackson, along with slaves who remained with the Patriots, watched the horses, probably most likely Indians or indentured servants, right, from Europe, watched horses for the men fighting the British. Jackson was at Hanging Rock with the closest thing to a father he ever had, Uncle James Crawford. Jackson witnessed the brutality of war as his cousin was shot through the body. In an effort to clean the gash, someone drew a handkerchief through the wound. Thinking his cousin, also named James Crawford, was dying, Jackson, his brother Robert, and his other Crawford cousins laid the wounded man down near a creek with his head resting on his coat as a pillow. Crawford was still alive but dying. The young man left the body thinking that in a day or two the women would come and recover the body. Crawford later recovered, but the British had badly wounded a member of Jackson's family. The Americans won a moral victory at Hanging Rock as they bloodied the British and seized 100 horses and 250 guns. The Americans had struck a blow for freedom and against popery at Hanging Rock. The Scotch-Irish were not alone in their defense of the Waxhaws, all right? Scotch-Irish, these are your family, a lot of your ancestors. While Jackson kept watch over the soldiers' horses, American slaves joined him in the watch. A dozen Catawba warriors helped defend South Carolina and fought to protect Jackson's cousin, Jim Crawford. While Jackson's cousin was on the verge of losing his life, loyal Indians, the Catawbas, once again helped their neighbors of the Waxhaws. Following the brief success at Hanging Rock on August 6, 1780, the Waxhaw men suffered a loss at Camden. After the Americans lost 900 killed or wounded, plus 1,000 captured at Camden, many Waxhaw residents fled the region so that the land looked empty. It was after the loss at Camden that Greene assumed command of the American forces in the Carolinas by replacing General Horatio Gates. Cornwallis punished the Americans severely by giving their property to Tories, imprisoning captives, and setting up camp for the British in the Waxhaws. Cornwallis' new headquarters in September 1780 was the abandoned house of Jackson's cousin, Robert Crawford. The Waxhaws was a terrible scene in the fall of 1780. Near the Catawba settlement, the depredations of both parties had made a desert of Jackson's neighborhood. Its residents had fled across the North Carolina border, and its troops had dispersed. Disappointed to see the condition of the region, one American lamented that it has been ravaged and plundered by both friends and enemies. I am really afraid it will be impossible to subsist the few troops we have. Even the British were disappointed with their new temporary home. Tarleton said that by the end of September 1780, 3 weeks after setting up camp in the Waxhaws, flour, cattle, and forage were collected with difficulty by the main army, the depredations having made a desert of the country. After fleeing their home, Jackson's mother faced great fear while a refugee in North Carolina by worrying about atrocities that may be committed by the British. The Hessian troops, the auxiliaries, remember, a lot of these were black Hessians that they were being used to fight in these wars all over the world, including here in the Americas, colonial times, and also by the who? The Cherokees and Tories. All these are allies. This is what the Catawbas and the Carolinian settlers were facing, a combination of all four. The British forced the Jacksons to flee General Cornwallis' army and leave the Waxhaws for North Carolina in September 1780, when Jackson was 13 years old. Elizabeth Jackson, referred to as Betty, her sister, brother-in-law John McCamey, a black girl named Charlotte, John Andrew Jackson, and several horses fled the British and stayed with Alexander. Betty was distraught about things being left in desolation at home in the Waxhaws. She feared everything they had would be destroyed, and they hid many of their things in the woods. From 1781 to the end of the war in 1783, the British, Hessians, and Cherokees, along with other Indians, were certainly a threat, but the more immediate danger in North and South Carolina was the Tories. At age 14, Jackson, while serving as a bodyguard to Captain John Land, suffered an assault by the Tories in March 1781. During this attack, Tories shot Jackson's uncle, James Crawford, who later died from the wound, while Jackson escaped. The British sympathizers took the life of Jackson's mentor, Crawford, who was his father figure, the man who provided for Jackson his brothers and his widowed mother, and the leader of the Waxhaw settlement local Presbyterian church. Jackson joined many Whigs in wanting revenge on these murderers. Some Whigs wanted to mutilate the Tories and British, and let the birds eat the corpse. Reflecting later in life, Jackson noted that some Americans did exact vengeance, but with a guilty conscience later. Jackson said that he had a friend who killed over 20 Tories, but never was a happy man afterwards. Jackson particularly hated the Tories. Throughout the 1770s in the Waxhaws, bands of outlaws, including runaway slaves, terrorized the district. When the war began, these same outlaws became Tories and sought British protection. Even some British prison guards were ashamed of the actions of the Tories, as Jackson noted how a Massachusetts Loyalist captured Jackson and imprisoned him, treating the prisoners harshly and inhumanly, while confined. Jackson and many others in the Waxhaw community had many reasons for wanton vengeance on the British, particularly following the British imprisonments of numerous young males from the neighborhood. Jackson, his brother Robert, and some of his Crawford cousins were prisoners of the British in April 1781 at the Camden jail. Soon after the capture, a British officer ordered Jackson to clean his boots, degrading the young man. Jackson refused, contending that he should be treated with the dignity attached to an official prisoner of war. The officer struck Jackson across the forehead with a sword, leaving a deep cut, which later scarred and cut across his fingers, which Jackson had used to try to block the attack. Jackson and the Americans saw themselves as independent and equal to the British, whereas the British dismissed the Patriots as rebels. Jackson's mistreatment at the hands of the British fueled his anger. The British had put Jackson, along with roughly 250 more prisoners, in jail in Camden. When the British realized the relation of the Jacksons and the Crawfords, they separated them. Jackson recounted that no attention whatever was paid to the wounds or the comfort of the prisoners. Smallpox broke out in the camp, causing many to suffer. Jackson said that he frequently heard them groaning in the agonies of death, and no regard was paid to them. Jackson became infected with the contagion. He later said that he was abused very much while imprisoned. The guards, according to Jackson, threatened to hang us all soon after they defeated the American army. Even British Captain Robert Campbell recognized that Jackson and his fellow prisoners were being treated badly and inhumanly at the Camden prison. Among the abuses was the fact that some British guards withheld food from the prisoners and gave it instead to their plundered Negroes. Dodged the hijack to their slaves, or indentured servants and Indians. So this is all happening to him, this is all before the Indian relocation, right? This is the hatred he had against the British and Cherokees. Jackson's mother arranged a prisoner exchange, and Jackson, stricken with smallpox and a wounded head, walked out, while his brother Robert, who also had a head wound which may have caused his premature death, and weak because of a severe bowel complaint, rode a horse alongside his mother. The 45-mile journey away from the prison camp was horrible. Robert died 2 days later. Jackson blamed Robert's death on the abuse and neglect shown by the British guards. The British took Jackson's shoes and jacket, forcing him to walk barefoot. He said that the fury of a violent storm of rain caused him and his family to be exposed, further resulting in sickness to the point that he became dangerously ill. Jackson's mother nursed him back to health as best she could, but he still suffered during the spring of 1781. She rushed to Charlestown to care for William and James Crawford, who were imprisoned in Charlestown, and negotiate a possible prisoner exchange. After giving Jackson's cousins medical attention in prison, Jackson's mother left Charlestown to return home. She died 3 miles outside of Charlestown. Betty Jackson had caught typhus from one of the prisoners she treated, which resulted in her untimely death. One of Jackson's cousins died in Charlestown as a prisoner of war. and the other was eventually released and went home to the Waxhaws. Betty Jackson never returned home to the Waxhaws and never had a public funeral. Her body lies in an unmarked grave near Charleston. All right, that was the fate of Andrew Jackson's mom. So you see all this grief he's carrying, you know. By the spring of 1781, the British and Tories were responsible for the death of his brothers Hugh and Robert, his mother, and his uncle. They also continued to destroy the Waxhaw settlement. Jackson, through the spring of 1780, ached with the burning of smallpox, headaches, weakness, along with chills and fever from malaria following the smallpox. He suffered through all this as his mother left him to care for others, and his brothers were dead. At age 14, Jackson was an orphan, homeless, and dependent on others. All right, this is Jackson's life. Listen, at 14, his father, mother, and brothers were all dead, with no stone marking their burial places, and the British onslaught continued. In April 1781, the British performed one of their most devastating acts in the Waxhaw community by destroying the church, the Waxhaw Meeting House. This infuriated young Jackson. The building was the center of the small Waxhaw community of less than 1,000 people. Jackson grew up 4 miles from the meeting house, and he, along with most Ulster immigrants, right, Ireland, and the Waxhaws, attended church there every Sunday. Members of the community did very little visiting and did not work on Sunday, as virtually all families in the community were fellow worshippers at the Waxhaw Meeting House. The church was more than just a meeting place. It was also the center of the Waxhaw law and order. British destruction of the meeting house was an attack on the heart of the settlement, and the Waxhaw civil suits were almost unknown prior to the mid-1770s. The local church was the court in many situations. Litigation was low prior to the mid-1770s in the South Carolina backcountry because the circuit courts had yet to be established, and litigation in distant courts would be expensive and time-consuming. The Waxhaw Church also had an excellent minister in Jackson's childhood, William Richardson, whom the church members highly trusted and would have little reason to turn elsewhere to resolve disputes. The Presbyterian congregation led by Richardson handled morals and standards of conduct, settled disputes, and monitored daily conduct. It was more influential than either of the North Carolina or South Carolina governments because law was local in the Waxhaws. The church particularly handled disputes over property and boundaries in Jackson's youth as the rising immigration rates, multitudes of new surveys, haphazard techniques of 18th century surveyors, expanding markets, and open-range grazing of livestock led to more and more disputes. Church members were accustomed to the sessions or religious courts, which heard cases regarding sexual offenses, listen, in the church, sexual offenses, false testimony, unethical business dealings, family discord, Sabbath breaking, profanity, and disputes between church members in civil cases. The meeting house in the Waxhaws was also a symbol of fighting British aggression. Within the Waxhaws, there were strong divisions between the Presbyterians, who were generally Whigs, and the Anglicans, who were generally Tories. The fight against the British was not just a fight against the king, but it was also a fight against the popery of the Anglican Church. In European colonial South Carolina, the deepest divisions were based on religious, not sectional, differences. Presbyterians would at times disrupt Anglican sermons in the South Carolina backcountry. Some Presbyterians would not allow non-Presbyterians to be baptized. There was little interdenominational marriage between Anglicans and Presbyterians, and the cultural and social boundaries between Anglican and Presbyterian were sharply drawn. In the South Carolina backcountry of Jackson's youth, the burning of the Waxhaw Meeting House was a victory on many levels for the British and Anglican Tories. The British invasion of the Waxhaws also affected the education of Jackson and other children. Jackson attended school as a young man, He had learned to read early on, which was typical for Ulster Irish communities. The average Ulster Irish community was at least 75% literate. Some historians suggest that these communities were up to 98% literate. Although Jackson was certainly literate, his degree of and desire for education is questionable. His mother stressed the need for education to young Andrew as she wanted him to be a Presbyterian minister. Because his mother so desired Jackson to be a minister, he had the benefit of a better education. Jackson had studied the dead languages, and on occasion throughout his life he uttered Latin phrases. Most importantly to his mother, however, was his religious education. The local minister inspected every Presbyterian child educations in the Waxhaws. The ministers came by homes of the congregation members to make sure that each child had memorized the Westminster Catechism, which was a series of 107 questions and answers that summarized the basic Presbyterian doctrine. The British invasion, however, cut his educational opportunities short. The War for Independence began shortly after Jackson's 8th birthday. The British attack of South Carolina forced the shutdown of the academy of Jackson was attended in 1779. Jackson and his family retreated to Charlotte, North Carolina, where he briefly attended another academy until the British attack on Charlotte in February 1780. The Tories inflicted wounds, disease, death, and imprisonment on the Presbyterians. Between the attacks, retreat, supporting troops, and his later capture by the British Army, Jackson had little time to devote to education in the formative years between the ages of 8 and 16. When the British withdrew from Charlestown in 1782, Cherokees and Chickasaws, with loss of faith, sought peace with the Americans, while the Choctaws wavered and the Creeks remained with Britain. The Cherokees, however, raided North Carolina and Virginia again before peace negotiations could begin. In January 1783, a large contingent of Indians, including Mohawks, Senecas, Delawares, Shawnees, Mingos, Tuscaroras, Upper Creeks, and a smaller group of Lower Creeks and Cherokees went to St. Augustine to tell the British that they wanted to continue resistance. The Americans demanded that the Cherokees deliver prisoners, drive the British out of the Chickamauga towns, and send Cherokee volunteers to raid hostile Chickamauga towns. North Carolina Governor Martin told Virginia Governor Benjamin Harrison that peace was more beneficial with the Cherokees than punishment because peace was necessary on some permanent principles, that the cruelties and horrors of the Indian War, intolerable among civilized nations, in future may be prevented. While most of the Cherokees were already leaning toward peace, the British decision to leave America forced them into the peace camp. The British decision to abandon the war effort and sign the Treaty of Paris in 1783 shocked the Indians, while the Cherokees and even some Chickamaugas released some prisoners in hopes of peace late in 1782. It was not until the British evacuation that the Indians to the west truly bargained for peace. By 1783, when the war was over, the Chickamaugas' supply of guns, powder, blankets, and horses, which they had received from the British and Spanish throughout the war, was disrupted, but only temporarily. They renewed trade with Europeans after the war, all right, who? The Chickamaugas, and harassed settlers in Tennessee. The Overhill Cherokees politely requested a demarcation of the boundary from North Carolina and requested that the North Carolina government stop European encroachment. In the meantime, the Cherokees gave land to the Americans, and the Cherokees were bounded by the Tennessee, Holston, and French Broad Rivers. The Americans guaranteed observance of the boundary line and punishment of whites or Europeans who trespassed, licensed traders. and appointed Joseph Martin as state agent for the Cherokees. Martin and Donaldson then met separately with the Chickamaugas and gave them 1,000 pounds of supplies in return for land north of the Tennessee River. Once the outcome of the war was decided in 1783, the Creeks and Cherokees began to return some property voluntarily. The Chickasaws wanted peace with the Americans, and John Donaldson of the Cumberland settlement came east looking to speed up negotiations. The Chickasaws, desperately seeking peace, rushed the negotiations. The end of the war reduced the Cherokees as a major power rival of the frontier settlers in the Carolinas because the Treaty of Paris, 1783, left the Cherokees without immediate access to the guns and powder. The Cherokees in 1783 stood by as settlers from North Carolina came across the mountains, took up hunting grounds, and eventually set up the state of Franklin. The new onslaught of European settlers pushed many moderate Cherokees into the hostile Chickamauga ranks. In Tennessee, the hostilities continued as more and more settlers came onto or near Cherokee land throughout the 1780s and 1790s. The Catawbas did not lose territory in the Treaty of Paris 1783, but they lost influence as the Americans no longer needed them. All right, you see, they were using the Catawbas the whole time. They didn't need them now. Now that the Cherokees wanted peace by force, because now they didn't have their allies, the British, right, helping them. So now they don't need the Catawbas, these so-called Americans, as an ally in a military South Carolina backcountry. The South Carolina legislature paid the Catawbas from time to time in food for their service during the war. The Catawbas, however, did not get the same respectful treatment later and were surprised because, as they said in 1786, when petitioning for hunting rights in South Carolina, they had always been loyal friends to the European people, and during the late war, we have exerted ourselves as good soldiers on behalf of this state. The South Carolina legislature did grant the request for the hunting rights. Still surprised at the lack of reward after the war, a Catawba leader said, "I fought against the British for your sake. The British have disappeared, and you are free. Yet from me the British took nothing, nor have I gained anything by their defeat." All right, that's deep. He's like, I helped you, and the British never really did anything to me, and now they're not here. I helped you get rid of them, and look how you're treating me. Like you're not helping me at all. You're not appreciative of our help to you against the British. Still, the Catawbas remained loyal. Years after the war, when the Catawbas found that some of their tenants on their land had been Tories, they tore down their houses and kicked them off the reservation. While the Catawbas were weakened, poor and afraid, some Cherokees were weakened as well. Other Cherokees, however, regrouped and became as hostile as before in the Chickamauga Nation. The British were gone in the legal sense, just some stayed behind, and with the Spanish continued to supply hostile Indians to attack Americans. The Americans, exhausted from revolution, forced a stronger union with a more centralized constitution. Back in the Waxhaws in 1783, things were much more peaceful. The community began to rebuild. Even though the heart of the community, the church, was destroyed. Almost all Tories had either been killed or had fled the region. When South Carolinians found 6 British men at the close of the war, they executed them in a sign that the anger was still alive, though the threat, particularly from Britain, was diminishing. Jackson alone, because of the British war, now had to find his place. All right. So, and we reached the end of this chapter. All right. So again, this is chapter 2. We did a chapter 1 reading. Make sure to check out that video. We're going to definitely end it here so we don't make these videos too long. Again, we're doing this just to have a little background, a little context behind, the previous years before Andrew Jackson and the whole Indian relocation of the Cherokees, the Trail of Tears, and all that. So you guys can understand the whole history It's not just one-sided. It's not just bias. It's not about an evil, just an evil. Even though he did evil things to certain Indians, you know, again, he had personal issues with. He has personal issues with, and personal experience throughout his years as a youth, as you guys can see, and a little background to these wars as well. Another side of the story. There's always different sides to of the stories. You know, we get a lot of different versions from different peoples, depending on who they're representing. You know, what side they were on, what who their ancestors side. You know, what side their ancestors were on, and all that. But again, I hope you guys at least enjoyed the reading. I know a lot of you do. I like to get a whole background. This is gonna be very helpful for future presentations. You guys will see what I mean. Again, thanks for just tuning in and listening to me read to you, you know, this whole time today. I appreciate you guys taking the time to do that. You know, again, I'm going to end it here. We're going to definitely finish the article. We got, I believe 4 more chapters. I think there's like 6 chapters in this article. Pretty interesting background to understand. If you're interested in history like this, in colonial history and important people or historical people, this is pretty interesting. So thank you for taking the time to do that. Thanks to all my moderators. Thanks to all my Patreons, all the new channel members. Appreciate you guys for all the support, all the longtime followers. Thank you. I'm going to keep coming with way more and more videos, more history, more unknown things. Hopefully, we can get through them faster, as I'm getting better at recording and getting, a lot more used to it. We can kick these videos out a lot quicker than before. But thanks for your patience. Anyways, thanks for being there all these years. Again, you guys have a great day or great night. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Wow.